Hey everybody, it's Phil Strazula from Select Software Reviews, and I'm here with Chelsey Griggs, who is the Chief Strategy and Risk Officer at Atlas. Today we're going to talk about EORs. This is a 101 on EORs. What are they? EOR versus PEO, who needs one? When you start to look at them, how do you think about pricing, the pitfalls, the things that you need to know to pick the right vendor? Chelsey, thanks so much for joining us. Do you mind giving us a quick background on yourself and what you do on a day-to-day basis now?
Yeah, thanks, Phil. Glad to be here. So a little bit of background about me. I've been at Atlas, EOR provider for the last year and a half. Prior to that, I spent 25 years in tech, management consulting, and human capital management software. So lots of big HCM providers in my background: Ceridian, Infor, Lawson Software. Love the HR space. And this is kind of an adjacent market to that that's growing. So I joined Atlas on kind of that growth journey as the head of strategy when I started. And really what I do every day is work on our growth agenda. And that growth agenda has kind of two parts to it. One is what you would logically think of as far as revenue growth and different services we can provide and a deliberate way of doing that. The other side of that is being really thoughtful about how we scale our business. So EOR is a new market. We've been around 8 years. So I have to think kind of on both sides of that about how do we build for scale, especially because compliance is so important to this particular business.
That's amazing. And it sounds like in the future, we should do another conversation around how HCM tech has changed over the last 25 years and where you see it going. So that'd be super, super interesting, especially for an HR tech nerd like myself.
Yeah,
But
me too.
for the topic of today, do you mind just setting the table with what is an EOR?
Yeah, absolutely. So an EOR is a solution provider that can allow for companies to hire globally where they don't have a legal entity. So that may seem very straightforward, but there's many, many scenarios where companies are trying to figure out, how do I hire in a particular country? And it's complicated, it's time consuming, and there's a lot of compliance related things that they need to consider. So this is a method to be able to hire globally.
Awesome. And so what sorts of companies typically need an EOR?
Yeah, great question. So having come from the HCM space, I had kind of the traditional understanding of customers, right? You've got your kind of small business, your mid-market, your enterprise, right? And that all kind of went to the side when I came to EOR. And here's why. Any customer can use EOR. And so traditionally, I believed that small businesses, high growth, that were trying to land in a new country, maybe they want to establish a sales presence. So they're going to hire a GM of sales in LATAM. And so it's one person. They're thinking, I need to figure out how to hire this person. I don't have an entity. My solution is EOR, right? So that would be one scenario. And like I said, that's kind of what I assumed the majority of EOR was when I came to Atlas. What I quickly learned, though, is that one, they're not usually looking at just one country. It's usually multiple, not necessarily even in the same region. And two, it's not just small businesses. So I'll give you an example of something that I found interesting. So we have a client who's a large US retailer, and you would think they'd be capable of, expanding into whatever country they need to expand into, but they had a high performer who wanted to move back to their home country during the pandemic, right? And as we all know, the pandemic changed lots of things in business. But they wanted to retain this person, and they weren't going to put forth the dollars and the effort to build an entity in this country for one person. As an example, sometimes certain countries take many, many months to establish an entity. And so just the ability to retain this person, allow them to work remote in a new location, EOR was a solution for that retailer. So you wouldn't assume a retailer that size would have that kind of a need. And that's how it kind of starts with some of them. And then they realize, oh, I could use this for other services where we want to expand or grow.
Do you find that when companies get to a certain scale in a given country, it makes sense to do it themselves versus using a third-party EOR?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the big challenges when I came on board and was trying to understand how to build a strategy, right, around growth, was there was this belief that when you hit a certain number of employees, you'd no longer be needed. So if you think about the customer journey, it felt as though, let's say we hit 30 employees in a country, and it varies by country, but let's use that number as an example. It may be more cost effective at that point, and because of the growth agenda of that customer, for them to establish their own entity. So for example, at Atlas, we provide services to consult on how to do that. We obviously recognize that that's logical at some point in certain countries. But what I came to learn was that because most of these companies are establishing in multiple countries, they may go and establish their own entity in China, but still need EOR services for the ones where they're only going to have 5 to 10, right, at any given point in time. So it's actually a mix of both, but there is kind of a threshold, and it depends on the country and kind of the plan for that particular client, right? They may always want to keep it that way and maintain it more like an outsourced solution.
Can you talk about the differences between a PEO and an EOR?
Yeah. So the big difference to me is that who is the employer, okay? So in a PEO, it's joint or co-employment, right? So both the PEO provider and the client have responsibility for the employment of the individual, okay? So if you think about that playing itself out, that means that if there's an issue, so an HR issue of some sort, both have liability, both have responsibility or accountability for helping resolve whatever that issue is. So I remember very specifically a client we were talking to who wanted me to explain what the difference was between PEO and EOR, because she had had a bad experience with a PEO where, it kind of got to that place where she had been sold and they had employees in that co-employment scenario and there were issues, and that she realized that she ended up having to get involved in a lot of those issues more than she expected. And with the EOR, we are the legal employer of record. So we are accountable. Obviously, we have commercial terms around things that where it would be logical that one or the other would need to take responsibility or liability, but the full legal employer of record is the EOR. That's the distinct difference between the two. The other thing to note is likely the fact that in some countries, and many people don't realize this because PEO is very much a domestic solution at first, in many countries, you can't do co-employment. So it's actually not allowed in countries like Spain. So in those scenarios, if we have a client in that region, we have to have our own entity and they can't have an entity, right? So that's actually a requirement in certain countries.
Do you have a perspective on when it becomes too complex for an organization to employ people in lots of different countries? Like if you're a, I don't know, 20-person company and you're in 7 countries, would you like grab that CEO and say, hey, look, you gotta, get it down to 5 or 3, or does an EOR solution allow it to sort of be agnostic in terms of how many countries you operate in?
Yeah, EOR definitely allows you to be agnostic to that. It will depend on the provider. So I will tell you that depending on the model of the EOR provider, it can be easier or more complicated. That's not a good or a bad, it just is the variation in the models. But I don't think the number of entities that you're working in with an EOR provider is what's most critical to think about. I think it's about how it is managed, right? So having regional, for example, our model is to have regional representatives. So you can speak to people in that region. So if you're a multinational, for example, you may have a headquarters in the US. That's many scenarios are like that, right? But your on the ground team working in Serbia would want to speak to someone in the native language and be supported in the native language. So I think one of the key factors when thinking about an EOR is, can they support you in region? Is it a model where you're working directly with staff from the EOR provider, or are you being passed off to a third party in that region because they don't actually have presence in the region?
And so that latter model you would say is suboptimal because it's hard for your EOR provider to make sure that there's a high standard across all their different partners in all the different countries.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's value to both, obviously, for different reasons. But we are solely a direct employer of record. So if you hear the terms as folks listen to this discussion and they're thinking about what does it mean to be direct or indirect, they see that out there when they surf the web. Direct means we own our own entities. And we have people on the ground that manage that, and those are Atlas employees, for example. So we are direct in over 160 countries, which means that we are accountable for the service in each one of those. You're going to work with an Atlas employee, whether that be for customer support, sales and account management, et cetera.
Got it. Would you recommend, or when would you recommend somebody get an EOR? So I guess I'm thinking about somebody out there who's like, hey, I started a business last year. We've got 5 employees. We've got one in Colombia, one in, I don't know, India, one in somewhere else, and a few in the US. What's my risk really in terms of like the Colombian government coming after me? Like, can I just pay this person as a contractor? Should I wait till I have 2 or 3 people in a given country, or I'm at a certain scale in terms of my business before adopting this sort of tech or this sort of offering?
Yeah, great question. So we actually get a lot of calls from people who have hired and then realize that they're paying in a non-compliant way. They didn't realize when they started, they assumed they could pay out of their UK entity, right? Maybe they're headquartered out of the UK. And then they realize we're in trouble. We didn't realize this was a problem. And they find out different ways, right? It may be that, we've had scenarios where someone got injured, and we've heard about this at a client, not one of our clients. And they suddenly went, oh, we haven't been paying them in the right jurisdiction. Now we have a problem, right? So I would recommend, before you get into that situation, but that's not always the case, right? People make mistakes and they don't realize that it's a problem. So as quickly as you can, if you don't have your own legal entity, I would highly recommend looking at employer of record.
Okay. And I guess the trade-off here with taking on that risk is obviously the cost.
Yeah.
Can you talk about how these models are priced and all the different fees?
Yeah, absolutely. So from an employer of record service fee, we charge a flat fee. We don't do a percent of payroll. So you'll see kind of those models vary across different providers. So that flat fee includes, the responsibility we take on for liability. It varies by number of employees and number of countries. So there are different rates to some degree by country, depending on the nature of the requirements in that country. Not large gaps, but there is some variation there. So I think when exploring employer of record, I think those are questions that individuals, customers want to think about, right? What's included in this fee? If it is a flat fee, help me understand a bit more about that. And similarly, you'll see a lot of new entrants into the EOR market. As you mentioned earlier, it's growing fast. It also, I believe, got an injection from the pandemic, where people were trying to figure out, okay, now how do I help these people live and work in other countries? And just the acceptance of that, right, in the HR space now, that we all have to kind of find ways to support remote work. So I think one of the big questions when you look at fees is what's included in that. Am I going to get surprised later because maybe a new entrant isn't as deep in their compliance and experience? So I would definitely look at providers that have longevity when it comes to understanding the compliance by country, by region.
And what's like a ballpark? How should I maybe try to calculate like what my cost might be?
I don't know that I could even give you a ballpark, to be honest. And I read your recent report on EOR and some of the pricing that you had reviewed in the market. And I think you'll see that varies tremendously, because it depends on, for example, if you have multiple employees, then you may be able to get somewhat of a discount in some scenarios if you're going to onboard them more quickly. The other thing that's very interesting about employer of record is that coming out of the software space, in my background, you start charging for the software, at the point in time that software is implemented, for example. In the employer of record space, you may onboard employees at different points in time, right? So you may say, we're going to contract for 10 individuals in Pakistan, 3 individuals in Brazil, and 1 individual in Australia, right? And they may onboard at different points in time. So those are all factors that go into the pricing and when, billing would happen, et cetera. So it's hard to give you kind of it isn't like the PEPM model where I can say, we charge Pepin for X or per employee per month. It's very different from that.
Okay. And what about any hidden fees? I know like FX exchange can be a sort of a hidden fee, like anything else that people should be aware of?
Yeah, I think that's why I made the comment around longevity of the vendor, because what I've seen happen, and this happens in all industries, right? Where our competitors, we pick up a client that used to work with one of our competitors, right? They come to us and say, we're unhappy with X. And in that, what we hear is that there were costs that came up that individual competitor didn't make them aware of upfront. So it came as they realized in their maturity that they needed to be charging more or charging one-off for what they realized in a particular country. Sometimes that's based on a third party, right? They may have a third party relationship, so they have less control over their costs because the entity itself is owned by a third party that EOR is sourcing through, right? So that's that indirect model versus the direct. So making sure you understand the full upfront costs, and then asking questions about some of those compliance factors and how they're included.
What are the other considerations people should keep in mind when looking at an EOR provider?
Yeah, so a couple things come to mind. So one is the model, right? So the direct versus indirect, how long, the longevity, how long an EOR provider has been in a particular market. So for example, are they going to open an entity for you, for example, which takes long periods of time, in some cases, quick in others. So do they have it? Do they have it established? Do they have support in that region or that country to answer the questions and ensure that you're following the regulations, for example? I think the other thing that I have realized, and this is kind of when you mentioned at the beginning, I play both the strategy role as well as the risk role, is the importance of risk and compliance to this industry, right? And that is, you are buying a service with EOR where you assume that they are compliant, right? And that they take compliance seriously, because that's something you've kind of abdicated to this provider, right? So asking questions about how they support that, what do they have as far as resources to support that? You know, we have, for example, both a risk and compliance team. We have entity managers that are on the ground in those regions managing our requirements around entities. We also have part of our platform, which is an insights tool. So you can go and look up and learn as a user and as a client about the laws, things to consider, things like termination clauses, right? It's very different between countries, how easily you can terminate an employee. So you can go and learn. You have some ways to kind of self learn. And then you also have the reliance of kind of that infrastructure to ensure that your risks are managed effectively.
Awesome. Chelsey, thank you so much for taking the time out, sharing your insights and your experience with us and our readership. If somebody is interested in following up, where can they learn more about Atlas or connect with you?
Absolutely. So Atlas URL is www.atlaszhxm.com. It stands for Human Experience Management, the HXM. You can reach me at chelseig@atlaszhxm.com. Also LinkedIn. I'm an avid user, very much to your earlier point, Phil, love the HCM space. So very connected to people in that space and would love to just have dialogue about what people are trying to decipher and learn in this space. See how I can help.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Nice to